The pursuit of equality remains an ongoing struggle for societies across the globe. History paints a stark picture of divisions, prejudices, and the relentless struggle for fairness and justice. In the tapestry of America's narrative, systemic racism stands as a stark and enduring blemish, woven deeply into the fabric of its institutions, culture, and very identity. It is a legacy that continues to cast a long shadow, shaping the lives of millions and challenging the nation's commitment to its founding ideals. Systemic racism in America is not a recent phenomenon. Its roots run deep into the nation's past, entwined with its very foundation. To comprehend the complexities of this issue, we must first journey back in time, exploring the historical context that allowed such a system to take root and flourish. The story begins with the arrival of enslaved Africans on American soil, marking the beginning of a long and brutal chapter marked by exploitation, dehumanization, and the codification of racial hierarchy. The institution of slavery, driven by economic greed and a belief in white supremacy, became the bedrock of America's early economy, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's social fabric. Systemic racism operates through a complex web of interconnected systems, policies, and practices that, while often appearing race-neutral on the surface, work collectively to disadvantage and marginalize African Americans. It is a system of ingrained biases and historical disadvantages that permeate every facet of American society, creating an uneven playing field where opportunities are limited and justice is often elusive. In the realm of education, systemic racism manifests in the stark disparities between predominantly black and white schools. Funding inequities, resource allocation, and implicit biases within the education system contribute to an achievement gap that limits the life chances of countless black students. From early childhood education to higher education, the system perpetuates a cycle of disadvantage, hindering access to quality education and perpetuating existing inequalities. While the focus of this documentary is on systemic racism in America, it is crucial to recognize that this issue is not confined to one nation or time period. Marginalized groups have faced oppression and exploitation due to systems of power and domination, often rooted in racial or ethnic prejudice. To fully grasp systemic racism, we must examine its historical and global context. To understand the deeply entrenched nature of systemic racism in America, one must turn back the pages of history to the very origins of the nation. The arrival of European colonists on American soil marked not only the beginning of a new nation, but also the genesis of a system of racial hierarchy that would shape the course of American society for centuries to come. Driven by a thirst for land, resources, and labor, European settlers encountered indigenous populations whose ways of life differed vastly from their own. This encounter, fraught with power imbalances and cultural misunderstandings, laid the groundwork for a system of domination and exploitation that would come to define the relationship between European colonists and people of color. The institution of slavery, while initially driven by economic expediency, quickly became interwoven with the emerging concept of race. European colonists, seeking to justify the enslavement of Africans, developed a system of racial categorization that placed themselves at the top of the hierarchy and Africans at the bottom. This racial ideology, rooted in pseudoscientific notions of white supremacy and black inferiority, permeated colonial law and social customs, shaping the lives of both enslaved Africans and free people of color. Laws were enacted that stripped enslaved Africans of their humanity, defining them as property rather than people, and denying them even the most basic human rights. The institution of slavery was not merely a moral abomination, it was also an economic engine that fueled the growth and prosperity of the American colonies, particularly in the South. The forced labor of enslaved Africans provided the backbone for a thriving agricultural economy, producing valuable crops such as tobacco, cotton, and rice that were exported to European markets. The wealth generated by slavery was not distributed equitably. Instead, it flowed primarily into the hands of the white planter elite, creating a vast chasm between the haves and the have-nots. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the subsequent ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States marked a pivotal moment in American history. However, the end of chattel slavery did not signal the end of racial prejudice or the systemic inequalities that had been woven into the fabric of American society. The decades following the Civil War, known as the Reconstruction era, were marked by both progress and fierce resistance. While African Americans celebrated newfound freedoms and sought to rebuild their lives, they faced significant obstacles, including widespread violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws designed to limit their economic and political power. With the end of Reconstruction, the South entered a dark chapter in its history marked by the rise of Jim Crow, a system of legalized segregation and discrimination that permeated every aspect of life for African Americans. From cradle to grave, African Americans faced a relentless barrage of discriminatory laws and practices designed to keep them separate and unequal. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation in public spaces, from schools and transportation to restaurants and restrooms. These laws, often justified by pseudoscientific claims of racial inferiority, created a system of separate and unequal facilities that denied African Americans access to quality education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. As the United States transitioned from a predominantly rural society to an urban industrial powerhouse, new forms of systemic racism emerged, often cloaked in the language of progress and economic development. One such practice, known as redlining, had a profound impact on the lives of African Americans, shaping residential patterns and exacerbating racial disparities for generations to come. Redlining, a discriminatory practice employed by the federal government and private lenders, systematically denied mortgages and other financial services to residents of predominantly Black and minority neighborhoods. These neighborhoods, often deemed hazardous or undesirable based solely on their racial makeup, were starved of investment, leading to disinvestment, decline, and a widening wealth gap between white and Black Americans. The legacy of systemic racism continues to permeate American society in the 21st century. Despite progress in civil rights, African Americans still face barriers to equality in every aspect of life. These barriers are woven into institutions, policies, and everyday interactions. Systemic racism impacts the economy, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. Stark racial disparities persist in wealth, income, health outcomes, and incarceration rates. One of the most glaring manifestations of systemic racism is the persistent economic gap between Black and white Americans. Despite decades of progress, African Americans continue to lag behind in wealth, income, and home ownership. These disparities are deeply rooted in historical and ongoing systems of discrimination. The racial wealth gap is a stark reminder of the enduring legacy of slavery and discriminatory housing policies. Education has long been hailed as the great equalizer, a pathway to opportunity and upward mobility. However, for many African American students, the promise of education remains unfulfilled as they navigate an education system rife with inequalities and disparities. From early childhood education to higher education, systemic racism casts a long shadow, limiting access to quality education and perpetuating a cycle of disadvantage. One of the most persistent challenges is the issue of school segregation. Despite the landmark Brown versus Board of Education ruling in 1954, which declared state-sponsored segregation in public schools unconstitutional, many schools remain racially and economically segregated. This segregation, often driven by residential patterns shaped by decades of discriminatory housing policies, concentrates poverty and disadvantage in predominantly Black and minority schools, depriving students of access to the resources and opportunities available in more affluent, predominantly white schools. The right to quality healthcare is fundamental to human dignity and well-being. Yet for many African Americans, access to quality healthcare remains elusive as they face a system riddled with inequities and disparities that contribute to poorer health outcomes and shorter lifespans. These healthcare disparities are not random or accidental. They are deeply rooted in systemic racism, reflecting historical and ongoing barriers to care that have persisted for generations. One of the most significant factors contributing to healthcare disparities is the lack of access to affordable health insurance. Prior to the Affordable Care Act, African Americans were disproportionately likely to be uninsured, limiting their access to preventive care and treatment for chronic conditions. While the ACA has expanded coverage to millions of Americans, including many African Americans, disparities in insurance coverage persist, reflecting broader economic inequalities and systemic barriers to enrollment. The criminal justice system starkly reflects systemic racism. African Americans face racial profiling, police brutality, and sentencing disparities. These issues are deeply embedded, reflecting historical practices. Systemic racism roots trace back to slavery and Black codes. Jim Crow laws justified mass incarceration for minor offenses. Beyond the tangible disparities in areas such as economics, education, healthcare, and criminal justice, systemic racism also manifests in the lack of representation and inclusion of African Americans in positions of power and influence. From government and media to corporations and cultural institutions, Black voices are often marginalized, silenced, or excluded, perpetuating a cycle of invisibility and limiting their ability to shape narratives, influence policies, and dismantle systems of oppression. This lack of representation has real-world consequences, as it reinforces stereotypes, perpetuates biases, and limits opportunities for Black people to fully participate in and contribute to society. When Black voices are absent from decision-making tables, policies are more likely to reflect the perspectives and priorities of the dominant group, often at the expense of marginalized communities. Systemic racism extends beyond the United States and recent history. Exploitation and oppression have been constants throughout human history. We must examine its impact on other cultures and communities. The Leal people of West Africa exemplify systemic exploitation. Their fragmented history reveals a vibrant culture altered by colonialism and the slave trade. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Leal people carved out a distinct identity for themselves in the bustling heart of West Africa. Though the precise details of their social structure and governance remain unclear, oral histories suggest a strong sense of community and a deep respect for tradition. Their lives were intricately woven into the fabric of the West African landscape, their livelihoods dependent on the fertile lands that sustained their agricultural practices. Beyond their agricultural pursuits, the Leal people were known for their skills as traders, navigating the complex network of trade routes that crisscrossed the region. They engaged in the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices, contributing to the vibrant economic and cultural exchange that characterized pre-colonial West Africa. The arrival of European powers on the shores of West Africa in the 15th century marked a turning point in the history of the region, ushering in an era of profound change that would have devastating consequences for countless communities, including the Leal people. Driven by a thirst for resources, wealth, and power, European nations sought to exploit the human and natural resources of Africa, forever altering the course of the continent's history. The transatlantic slave trade, a brutal and dehumanizing system of forced labor, became a cornerstone of European economic expansion. Millions of Africans, including many from the Leal community, were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, ripped from their families, their cultures, and their homelands. The impact of this forced migration was catastrophic, decimating populations, destroying families, and severing cultural ties that had endured for centuries. Today, the story of the Leal people remains fragmented, scattered across oral histories, fading memories, and the remnants of a culture forever altered by the forces of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Their history, like that of many marginalized groups, has been systematically erased, their voices silenced, their contributions overlooked. However, despite the challenges of reclaiming a lost past, descendants of the Leal people, scattered across West Africa and the diaspora, are piecing together the fragments of their heritage. Through oral histories passed down through generations, linguistic analysis, and the study of cultural practices, scholars and community members are working to reconstruct the story of the Leal people, restoring their rightful place in the tapestry of human history. To fully grasp the complexities of systemic racism and its profound impact on humanity, we must embark on a journey that transcends recorded history. This journey takes us to Africa, where the story of Homo sapiens began.
300,000 years ago, our ancestors emerged, setting the stage for human evolution.
For many years, the relationship between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals was shrouded in mystery and misconception. Neanderthals, often depicted as brutish and primitive cave dwellers, were seen as a separate and inferior species, destined for extinction as modern humans emerged on the evolutionary stage. However, advances in genetic analysis have revolutionized our understanding of these ancient relatives, revealing a far more complex and interconnected story than previously imagined.
Genetic evidence has confirmed that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did not merely coexist in certain regions, they interbred, leaving an enduring legacy in the DNA of modern humans. Studies have shown that individuals of European and Asian descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, a testament to the intimate interactions that occurred between these groups tens of thousands of years ago.
The concept of race, as it has been constructed and wielded throughout history, is a social and political construct, not a biological reality.
There is no scientific basis for dividing humans into distinct racial categories based on physical characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, or facial features. These superficial differences, often used to justify systems of hierarchy and oppression, represent a minuscule fraction of our genetic makeup and do not reflect the vast diversity that exists within and between human populations.
The myth of racial purity, the idea that certain groups possess an unadulterated lineage, has been used for centuries to justify slavery, colonialism, segregation, and other forms of discrimination. This dangerous ideology, rooted in pseudoscience and fueled by prejudice, ignores the overwhelming evidence of human interconnectedness and the complex history of migration, interbreeding, and cultural exchange that has shaped our species. The journey into our evolutionary past reveals a profound truth about the human experience. We are all connected, bound together by a shared heritage that stretches back to the dawn of our species.
From the first Homo sapiens who walked the African savanna to the complex tapestry of cultures and communities that make up our world today, we are all part of a single human family. This realization should inspire within us a sense of humility, empathy, and responsibility towards one another.
It should challenge us to confront the systems of oppression and inequality that have plagued humanity for far too long, systems often rooted in the false belief that some groups are inherently superior or inferior to others. Reflecting on the long journey of African Americans for equality, we feel sorrow for the injustices endured, outrage at systemic racism, and hope for a future of true equality. We are at a crossroads where the past shadows us, yet change shimmers on the horizon. The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others by law enforcement, coupled with COVID-19's impact on communities of color, remind us of systemic racism's deep roots. These events ignited protests and sparked a national conversation about race and inequality. Throughout history, protest has served as a powerful tool for social change, amplifying the voices of the marginalized, challenging the status quo, and demanding a more just and equitable society.
From the civil rights movement to the Black Lives Matter movement, African Americans have consistently taken to the streets to demand their rights, challenge injustice, and hold those in power accountable.
The protests that erupted in the wake of George Floyd's murder were not merely a reaction to a single incident of police brutality. They were a culmination of centuries of frustration, anger, and grief over the persistent reality of systemic racism.
They were a testament to the power of collective action, the unwavering spirit of resistance, and the enduring hope for a better future.
While protest is essential for raising awareness and demanding change, true progress towards racial justice requires a fundamental shift in policies and practices that perpetuate inequality.
This means addressing the systemic barriers that have long disadvantaged African Americans in areas such as education, healthcare, housing, employment, and criminal justice.
In the realm of criminal justice, calls for reform have focused on addressing racial bias in policing, demilitarizing law enforcement, ending cash bail, eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, investing in community policing, and providing re-entry services for formerly incarcerated individuals.
These reforms aim to create a more just and equitable system that prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment and recognizes the humanity of all individuals.
One of the most persistent and damaging legacies of systemic racism is the vast racial wealth gap that exists in the United States.
This gap, rooted in centuries of discriminatory policies and practices, leaves Black families significantly disadvantaged when it comes to building wealth, achieving financial security, and passing on opportunities to future generations.
Addressing this economic injustice requires a multi-pronged approach that tackles both historical and ongoing barriers to wealth accumulation.
This includes addressing discriminatory lending practices, providing access to affordable housing, investing in Black-owned businesses, creating pathways to homeownership, and providing financial literacy education.
Education has long been hailed as the great equalizer, a pathway to opportunity and upward mobility.
However, for many African American students, the promise of education remains unfulfilled as they navigate an education system rife with inequalities and disparities that limit their potential and perpetuate cycles of disadvantage.
Creating a more just and equitable education system requires a fundamental reimagining of how we educate our children, moving away from a system that often reinforces existing hierarchies and towards one that empowers all students to reach their full potential.
This includes addressing the legacy of school segregation, providing equitable funding for schools in low-income communities, diversifying the teaching workforce, implementing culturally responsive teaching practices, and addressing disciplinary disparities that disproportionately impact Black students.
The legacy of systemic racism is not just an economic or political issue. It is a deeply personal and traumatic experience that has left an enduring mark on the psyches of generations of African Americans.
The constant exposure to racism, discrimination, and violence takes a toll, leading to a range of mental health challenges, including anxiety, depression, PTSD, and substance abuse.
Addressing this trauma is essential to achieving true racial healing and reconciliation.
This requires acknowledging the deep wounds inflicted by centuries of oppression, providing access to mental health services, creating safe spaces for healing and dialogue, and promoting understanding and empathy across racial lines.
The fight for racial justice is not a sprint. It is a marathon, a long and arduous journey that requires sustained effort, unwavering commitment, and a belief in the possibility of a better future. It is a journey that demands the participation of all Americans, regardless of race, ethnicity, or background.
The path forward is not always clear, and there will be setbacks and challenges along the way. However, we must never lose sight of the ultimate goal, a society where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, free from the constraints of systemic racism and discrimination.
The time for complacency has long passed. Systemic racism is a human-made plague demanding our immediate action.
History's weight should fuel our resolve. The fight for racial justice demands active participation.
Dismantling the deeply entrenched structures of systemic racism requires a multifaceted approach, one that utilizes a diverse set of tools and strategies. It is not enough to simply acknowledge the problem. We must equip ourselves with the knowledge, skills, and resources necessary to effect meaningful change.
Education emerges as a primary weapon in our arsenal. We must educate ourselves and others about the history of systemic racism, its insidious manifestations in our institutions, policies, and everyday interactions. By understanding the root causes of inequality, we can begin to dismantle the systems that perpetuate it. Education empowers us to identify and challenge bias, to advocate for policy reform, and to create more inclusive and equitable communities.
The journey towards a future free from the scourge of systemic racism is a collective one, requiring the active participation of individuals, communities, and institutions across the globe. It is a future worth fighting for, a future where every individual, regardless of the color of their skin, has the opportunity to thrive, to reach their full potential, and to live with dignity and respect.
Imagine a world where the color of one's skin no longer determines their life chances, where access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and economic opportunities is a right, not a privilege reserved for a select few. Imagine a world where the criminal justice system treats all individuals fairly and equitably, where mass incarceration is a relic of the past, and where communities of color no longer live in fear of police brutality.